Hello and welcome to my research presentation. This is going to be about ADHD and ADD in the music classroom. How can the music educator identify the characteristics and accommodate for students in need? By Emily Zwijack. So the question that my research is all based around is how does ADHD and ADD present itself in the music classroom, and what can the music educator do to ensure the student has the best chance of success and proper accommodations? So before we get into all of my research, we're going to talk a bit about my process of arriving to this topic. So at the very beginning, I just started out by thinking about some of the challenges that might be presented to me in the future as a music educator. I also currently teach private students, so I thought a bit about what I was going through with my private students as well and what I could do better. I found 3 potential research topics that were interesting and resonated really well with me, which we'll talk a bit about in the next slide. In step 2, I spoke to people that knew about ADHD and ADD already, had learning disabilities themselves, or currently raising children with ADHD and ADD, etc. I made a poll online to determine what other musicians and educators believe is an underdeveloped research area, what they would be more interested in, or something that they think a music educator just needs to know. And by step 3, I began my research on ADHD and ADD. So I had 3 potential research projects, the first one being what I chose at the very beginning. I arrived at this topic because a couple months ago, I got a private student who has ADHD, and I'd heard of ADHD, but I had 0 prior knowledge. I didn't even know what it stood for. And I knew that in order to give my student the best chance of success, that I needed to learn a bit about what her situation was like and in what ways could I make her experience learning the violin even better and appropriate for her. And I talked to some parents that have a child with ADHD and ADD, and I'd actually, a little bit into my research, I had a couple professors come to me and say that I was showing symptoms of ADD. And so in the future, I may be getting tested for that just to see. But how bizarre. During my project, I realized this. My second research topic was what are the advantages and disadvantages of enforcing and prioritizing proper technique for a group of young beginner violinists? This was based on my public education experience in music and also my current students' experience. And the third research topic was what are the psychological effects that music education has on K-12 students who are battling with depression and anxiety? And this really just came from anxiety that I have had for as long as I can remember that really peaked around the junior high level. And I've just really been interested in the function of the brain and psychology. So maybe in the future, we'll be revisiting that. So in my research process, I first began by reaching out on Instagram to hear about others' experience with learning disabilities. So I have an Instagram, ThatViolinGirl6, where I post practice videos, and I've been doing this for about 6 years now, and I have met so many amazing fellow musicians from all around the world, and also other music educators that are either my age, studying to become a music educator, or current educators. And so this was actually a really great experience just to learn from all these different people about what their experiences are like with learning disabilities or teaching students with learning disabilities. And I also had a discussion with 2 parents that have a child with ADD, which was super helpful. Then I found some scholarly peer-reviewed articles. This was a process. I had no success with EBSCO, Oxford, or the general search engines on the Roosevelt Library website. And so after about 2 weeks of intense frustration, I reached out to another professor who guided me towards JSTOR. And we actually talked about ADD ourselves a bit, and they helped me find some articles. And I actually found some really amazing books as well, but I know that we're supposed to be using peer-reviewed articles, so I will save those books for the future for my brain. And finally, I ended up with 6 articles total. I read them, I took notes, and I eliminated the ones that weren't as relevant or helpful to my particular research focus. And I ended up with 3 articles to guide my research. Finally, the research. Let's get into it. So, like I said, I had zero prior knowledge to this on what ADHD and ADD even stood for, let alone what they were. So that's what we're going to start off with, is defining them. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and for short, we call it ADHD. Some of these symptoms are being extremely fidgety, talking excessively, having difficulty completing quiet activities, having so-called too much energy, presenting socially unacceptable behavior, and impulsivity. ADD, on the other hand, is attention deficit disorder, which is abbreviated as ADD. This constitutes having short attention span, trouble concentrating, distractibility, and poor impulse control. And it is very important to note that some students with ADD also have hyperactivity as well. They lack the ability to discern between more important and less important information, which, as you can imagine, can be extremely challenging in any classroom. And then I also wrote the definition of attending below, which is having difficulty paying attention, which is something that ADD students also have. And both ADD and ADHD present challenges in sustaining attention. They need to be constantly engaged. Teachers must keep the pace going, and lessons have to be interesting and relevant at all times. Now, this goes for all students, right? But with ADHD and ADD, it is extremely vital and necessary for them to learn. It's also super important to note that these behaviors are a result of the state of chemicals in the brain. These students are not intentionally just not paying attention or acting out just to upset you. It's not you, right? There's science behind this. And lastly, between 3 to 20% of children are diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. And it is diagnosed more frequently in boys than girls. Usually with girls, it is seen as symptoms of anxiety and treated as anxiety. And usually down the line, girls will realize that they actually have ADD and not anxiety. So very important to note. While I was looking through these peer-reviewed articles, I found two very important laws that help support these students. The first one is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is IDEA. This goes for students ages between 3 and 21 and states that no child in the United States can be denied a free and appropriate public education. I also included that little link below that talks a bit more about that law. And the second one is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This is a national law, and it bars discrimination on the basis of disability and all institutions receiving federal funding, which includes all public and most private schools, colleges, and universities. This protects qualified individuals from discrimination based on disabilities that substantially limit major life activities. So not only did I want to learn about what ADHD and ADD were, but I wanted to come up with some really great strategies for teaching and that I can use for my current student that has ADHD. And I know that this is going to come down the line as well when I'm teaching in the classroom environment. So I'd like to talk a bit about some strategies that I found in these articles. First things first, there are two examples of accommodations. The first one is adaptions, which are adjustments in the environment, instruction, or materials for learning that enhances the student's performance and allows for at least partial participation. So an example of this is, say that the school choir is rehearsing in the room next door to the orchestra room, and the sound is bleeding through the walls. So the teacher can make an adaptation so that that student doesn't have a music class during choir rehearsal. Now, I know changing schedules can be a little tricky, but if it's best for your students, I say go for it. And in adaptation, requirements stay the same, but the level of distraction is decreased. On the other hand, we have modifications, which changes the standard of participation or the extent of what a test or evaluation measures. An example of this can be that your student is struggling to learn scales, and they can be required to learn 4 scales instead of 8 like the rest of the students. Now, this can be a little tricky because you don't want your student to feel like they are less than capable of the other students. So you have to kind of get to know your student and see, is it best to give them this modification, or is it going to make them feel worse in the long run? And also, this is a little tricky because lots of schools have requirements that you must meet exact standards and all this. So if you need to advocate for your student and change that, advocate for your student. Don't let them have to go through all these difficulties when it can be modified for them and that they can have an even better learning environment, because that's the reason that kids are in school, is to learn. And for modifications, the requirements do change for the student. Arranging the learning environment. So the goal is to eliminate distractions for students with ADHD and ADD. And some of these examples are more private lesson based, but they can also go for the music classroom as well. First thing is clocks. So ADD students can become extremely overwhelmed by that 60 beats per minute ticking constantly. I'm sure some of us are, but for them, they just cannot focus. That is all they will focus on. So if you can get a clock that doesn't make that ticking sound, or just face them away from the clock as well, because even watching that hand can be distracting, that would be great. The second one is a little bit of a gimme, but don't have your phone out. And even if you turn like your ringer off and the student sees it flash, in their brain with like ADD or ADHD, they'll be like, oh, who's that who called? I wonder what they wanted. Is it important? Is it going to ring again? Like that's what's going to happen in their brain, right? And we don't need that distraction. So just when we're teaching, keep the phones away, and we can get to that later. Another thing is having the child face away from windows so they're not distracted by birds or the weather and cars, people, airplanes, all of that. And for hyperactive students, this is a little bit more for the private education experience. But if you can have like a fish tank or plants in the waiting room for your studio, it can help decrease the stress and put them in a bit of a calmer state. So in your classroom, maybe as students are shuffling in and grabbing their instruments, getting their music ready to go, sitting down in their chair, you can play a bit of calm music or any type of music just to help get them focused and relaxed and ready to go. Communication with parents. So in school, instrumental teachers have access to individualized education programs, which are IEPSs, for learning disabilities and necessary accommodations. But you can also have a further conversation with the parent or the student if there's anything else that you need clarification on. In private teaching, we don't get these. So you will have to ask the parent if the student has any learning disabilities when gathering information about a prospective student. And parents can also sit in on a lesson, one, just to learn about how they should practice. Now, this could also be seen as a distraction, having another person in the room while the student's trying to learn, or the child will think of them as their audience and it can help them focus. So it's get to know the student and learn about what works best for them. Practicing at home, super important. So I just came up with, from these articles, 4 different ways to make practicing a little bit more fun and activity-wise, so that way students aren't going to lose focus immediately with ADHD or ADD. This always gets them excited about practice and into it. So come up with 5 different ways to play the opening phrase in your solo. Sight read duets with friends for at least half an hour. Come up with a title for the etude you're working on this week. Find 3 YouTube videos of musicians performing your solo. Write down at least one thing you like and one thing you do not like about their performance. And I also just wanted to include very quickly on here CARE, which is an acronym for positive teaching that I read about in one of my articles. And CARE stands for concern, authenticity, respect, and empathy. So just some takeaways as we wrap up this presentation and things that we need to remember. So the teacher can be wonderfully experienced and highly stimulating, and ADD students will still have difficulty paying attention. You as the teacher are constantly competing with that mark on the wall or that flickering light. So it is not all you. You're doing your best to support these students and eliminate distractions, but don't beat yourself up over it. It's a process. And also remember that even without distractions, ADD students will still have difficulty keeping their attention on one task for a long period of time. And here are the 3 citations for my articles that I used in my research. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you can use this information to benefit yourself and your students.